Just what is the most dangerous place to sail on the Great Lakes? History has recorded horrible shipwrecks on every corner of the inland seas, but when you combine collisions and fires to the ships lost by foundering and stranding, certain patterns appear where the traffic is most congested.
Thunder Bay, Michigan, Buffalo, Milwaukee, and Duluth have more than their share of lost vessels. And it's no surprise the fabled Marysburg vortex is at the outflow of Lake Ontario into the busy St. Lawrence. These polygons of peril grew from the famed Bermuda Triangle of the 1970s, with books on the vortex and Lake Michigan Triangle captivating readers. Erie even has a 2,500-mile quadrangle where an alleged 430 shipwrecks have vanished. But few places are more feared than those dubbed the Graveyard of the Great Lakes, a moniker used by newspapers for over a century. Lake Erie seems to be the originator of the term, with Long Point getting the designation as early as 1903. The newspaper article doesn't share shipwrecks to support its claim to such disaster, but a search of 1903 brings up several shipwreck stories that may have put this in mind.
William Small was walking the beach when he picked up a whiskey bottle floating in Lake Erie. Inside, a note said the schooner Harpoon was sinking on September 17, 1901, and was simply signed Captain. Without a boat sailing the lakes named Harpoon and the non-descriptor signature, it was considered just a fake. Just a few days later, 7 waterspouts were reported off Long Point. The mate on the steamer Northland said he had to change course to avoid running into a funnel.
Later that month, the danger of the area was emphasized with a body being discovered. Walter Gregory was the chief engineer of the doomed propeller Sylvanus Macy, lost in a November gale that past year. The graveyard claim was challenged 20 years later, declaring Lake Michigan now held the title, but admitting the sad death total was due to the steamer Eastland, the worst maritime disaster ever for a lake boat. It could be argued that the 300 feet between these two drawbridges in downtown Chicago are the most deadly in history. Another polygon to ponder, as it was here that 848 lives were lost on one boat, a picnic excursion gone tragically wrong when the ship tipped over in 1914. Fred Hornburg was just 14 years old, working at Western Electric as an office clerk. He said, quote, "When the passengers got aboard, nearly all moved over to the side looking out on the river. The ship rolled over. Fred got 8 stitches after breaking out a porthole to get out." 1,500 people escaped the Eastland, and Fred ironically became bridge tender at the nearby LaSalle Street drawbridge. Here he saved 4 people from drowning. Lake Superior was said to be the most dangerous for freighters and other traffic in 1922. Again, no examples were cited, but with the loss of the tug Reliance at Lizard Island and the 1921 wreck of the Miztec, and 29 who vanished on the Superior City that previous year, it was clear the title was going to Lake Gitchagumi.
Let me clear up a misconception that was perpetuated by the loss of another big ship off Whitefish Point in 1975. Contrary to what Gordon Lightfoot sings and a quotation in Newsweek magazine that brought on the lyric, there is no Chippewa legend about the bodies on Gitchagumi.
This was attributed to the lake by a visiting author who sailed Superior in 1887, who noted how cold the water was to drink. Reporter Frank Wilkeson traveled from Buffalo to Duluth on a steamer loaded with iron rails, and it was the mate who told him that bodies were never recovered after sinking on Superior. Wilkeson's full story ran in the New York Times, but the sensational notion that a lake never gives up dead sailors turned into a story that ran for decades, but was eventually reduced down to a simple trivia line that Superior never gives up its dead. There is a Native American legend about such a lake, but it was from a tribe 1,500 miles west of Lake Superior. The Washoe elders told stories of a man-eating bird that haunted Lake Tahoe. It's believed the Anj had a nest deep below the cold mountain lake, and he would grab unsuspecting prey and drop them from a height that would kill them. The lake would then keep the victim on the bottom until the Anj could devour his prize. The legend says the Anj grabbed a young man named Tahoe and carried him aloft, but the warrior tied himself to the monster's leg and couldn't be shaken off. Tahoe threw poisoned arrows into the Anj's mouth, and quickly it was the bird who fell from the sky. Tahoe lived to return to his fiancée, but the monster's nest remained, the reason why no one was ever found if they drowned in the icy waters of Lake Tahoe. Countless news stories have been printed about the fact that victims were never recovered.
Wilkeson likely started the Great Lakes legend with his trip to Duluth, and he also caused waves of his own, saying the mate told him that nearly 500 sailors were lost annually on the lakes. This was highly exaggerated even in 1887, when over 200 seamen were lost to fresh water.
Wilkeson himself sailed into the same waters that claimed the Van Valkenburg during the week he crossed Lake Huron. The reporter warned of more disasters because of the rotten old schooners that were being towed to maximize profit.
The government had known for 20 years that increased traffic here on Lake Superior meant more shipwrecks, and Captain James H. Merriman of the Revenue Marine recommended 4 stations to guard this shipwrecked coast over Michigan's northern shore in 1874. And it wasn't really just outdated barges that were lost here.
The brand new schooner barge Atlanta was lost to the graveyard of the Great Lakes in 1891, and the 1-year-old F.W. Wheeler is also found here in deep water, lost in 1885.
After 6 years of reprinting Wilkeson's story, it was noted that 2 fishermen had vanished near the lumber mill here at Deer Park. There is widespread belief that Lake Superior never gives up its dead was the reason why their bodies were lost forever. Friends believe they were murdered for the $700 in gold watch the 2 men allegedly had on board with them.
In 1898, William S. Harwood wrote of Superior for St. Nicholas magazine. Quote, "A very sad thing about this lake is that it never gives up its dead. Whoever encounters terrible disaster and goes down in the angry blue waters never comes up again, their bodies preserved for centuries." Close quote. This article was also cut down to a short story that ran in hundreds of thousands of newspapers, and the legend was born. When the Bannockburn vanished on Lake Superior in 1902, the article said the 20-person crew would never be found because, quote, "Lake Superior never gives up its dead."
The sad truth is Gitchagumi most often gives up its lost sailors. Life-saving logbooks show many of those burials along here on the shipwrecked coast, especially when they were so badly decomposed that it was impossible to transport them. 2 families were buried along this beach near Deer Park, Michigan when the Western Reserve was lost. They had just enjoyed a summer trip across Lake Superior when the winds picked up and snapped the brand new freighter in half. The news came right to the doorstep, to the life station that once launched boats right here.
The logbook on August 31st at 2:30 p.m. reads that wheelsman Harry Stewart was the sole survivor from what was the largest ore ship on the Great Lakes. The crew and passengers managed to get into lifeboats, but Stewart said his boat overturned as it approached the coast, and he swam a mile to shore. Keeper Fromm immediately ordered the surf boat to the water, and they rowed towards Grand Marais to look for the crew. All they found that day were 5 life belts, 4 oars, and lifeboat number 2. Some of the people who were in that boat were found the next day. The ship's owner, Captain Peter Minch, and his sister-in-law, Mary Inglebury of Cleveland. The millionaire ship owner had $26.93 in his pocket. The sawmill at Deer Park was asked to make 3 coffins as Captain Fromm prepared for the bodies Stewart said were still in the lake. Philip Minch took the tug Andrew Smith to the Upper Peninsula to recover his father and hopefully get word on his mother, brother, and sister. Captain Albert Meyer's 10-year-old son Carl was found on September 7th, and each day brought new discoveries between 8 and 12 miles west of Deer Park. On September 16th, the lifesavers spent the day building more coffins, and Lake Superior revealed several more passengers from the Western Reserve. On September 19th, 6 more bodies were found, including 10-year-old Charlie Minch and Captain Albert Myers. Burt Township officials found a body, and 2 more were discovered near Grand Marais. The graveyard of the Great Lakes was living up to its terrifying reputation. In early November, the sister ship of the Western Reserve vanished in a storm on Lake Michigan with no survivors, leaving many to speculate it was the way the ship was built that led to the tragedy. On November 26, the 2 recovered lifeboats of the Western Reserve joined the remains of second mate Charles LeBeau on the steamer City of Green Bay to transit the locks and head down to Lake Huron. The sole survivor of the reserve became a captain, serving the Minch fleet for decades, including time on the first iron-hulled freighter, the Innoko. Lake Superior claimed that ship within 2 years of Stewart's command. Another sole survivor of the graveyard of the Great Lakes was second mate Charles Pitts, who lashed himself to a life raft after the Cypress foundered in 1907.
Cargo shifted as water came aboard and allowed waves to pour into the hatches. Captain Frank B. Hike pushed for Whitefish Point, and the survivor said the captain did not order the lifeboats lowered. The captain believed he could make the safety of Whitefish Bay.
At 7:45, the Cypress rolled over. 4 men made it to the raft, and 4 times the raft flipped in the tossing waves until only Pitts remained. He collapsed out of reach of the killer waves and was found by the Muskellunge Park lifesavers. The steamer George Stephenson passed Cypress so closely that Captain Harry G. Harbottle could see there were no tarps on the hatches. The lights of the Cypress suddenly vanished about 8 miles north of Deer Park. Cypress was only 3 months old, visiting Lake Superior only twice. Another November gale that next year took the entire crew of the DM Clemson. Captain Sam Chamberlain was bound for his hometown of Duluth, promising his wife he'd retire after this run for ore. His chief engineer had just lost his wife and unborn child, and the captain's cottage at Park Point was completely destroyed by fire a month prior. The season was made even more disastrous when the skipper opted to take the southern route on Lake Superior with a forecasted nor'wester.
The Clemson cleared the Sulaks with the J.H. Brown at 9:30 in the morning, but they lost sight of each other in the blinding storm off Whitefish Point. Captain Frank Chamberlain on board the Brown said he went north to avoid what he later described as house-high waves. Quote, "It was the worst gale I ever went into. Every swell would seem ready to swamp us. Time after time, the swells would break completely over the boat." Close quote. The captain said he had the engineers shut down the engines and they went adrift for 12 hours in heavy snow that blinded the crew. Wreckage was reported by the Dundee, and the W.H. Greywick reported hatch covers between Crisp and Vermilion Point. Lifesavers were notified by telephone to be on the lookout, and on December 11th, Sam McMullen was traveling his 7-mile mail route from Vermilion to Whitefish Point when he spotted a Clemson life jacket. The lighthouse keeper at Crisp Point spotted a body floating with a life belt on him, and on December 16th, they tried to recover him, but he slipped out of the belt and was lost. It turns out that that same mail carrier found that crewman, who was identified as Simon Dunn. Unfortunately, he was from Scotland and his family was not around to claim his body. The superintendent ordered Vermilion and Crisp to remain open a week after they were ordered closed, but half of the lifesavers had already left the station for the winter. That next spring, Dominion fish steamer Caribou was searching for the Otterhead Point lighthouse keeper who had left the station by boat, and all they found were oil barrels, a teak door, and an oar marked Clemson on Batchewana Beach. Keeper Robert McMenemy returned to his post on his own at Otterhead Station, much to the relief of his family and friends. Lifesavers on the shipwrecked coast were also sent out to look for the whereabouts of the Adela Shores in May of 1909. Overdue by nearly 2 weeks, it was last seen by the captain of the Daniel J. Morrell in Whitefish Bay.
Surfman Fuller at Muskellunge Life Saving Station finally found conclusive proof of the loss with a board and a cryptic message written in pencil. "There are 9 of us on a life raft. We are abreast," and then the message ends. The signboard of the Adela Shores was brought back to the station. Captain Sam Holmes had sailed with his brother and several other men from Milwaukee, Onkano, and Grand Haven, Michigan. Not a single man was recovered, fueling the legend of Lake Superior in 1909. The graveyard of the Great Lakes added 3 more boats with a gale that hit in November of 1916, when the Heinz lumber boats Curtis, Marvin, and Peterson were pushing through from Baraga to the Sulaks. Damage later found on the Selden Marvin showed the tow line snapped and part of the stern of the Curtis was torn loose. All of the crew were lost, with a mass grave dug in the Sioux for a dozen who were never claimed by family. The Peterson still lies undiscovered off Grand Marais.
Could the shipwrecked coast hold a grudge against any one boat or fleet? Most people would think that's silly that this lake discriminates, but history can't deny the misery caused by these waters to the Blodgett fleet of Bay City, Michigan. The curse seems to manifest in 1901 when the schooner Connolly Brothers was raising a distress flag when it nearly went aground near Munising. Blodgett's Zilla steamed out for the rescue.
In 1904, Zilla had to abandon the barge Agarita, which was listed as sunk by many newspapers. 22-year-old Captain Harry Keenan watched as the aft cabin was blown away in a storm, and the waves slowly filled the hold until the Zilla returned to snatch her from the tempest. They found the cook, Mrs. Moses Albright, lashed to a mast to prevent her from falling into the graveyard of the Great Lakes. Fires were lit on deck and then put out by the crew before they set the schooner afire. This was ironic because their rescue ship Zilla had nearly been destroyed by fire in 1900. The lumber was removed from the barge and the Agarita lived to sail another season until it caught fire on Lake Huron that next year.
In 1919, Blodgett's steamer named for his son Myron was caught off Whitefish Point in a gale towing the Miztec. Captain Walter Neal was found nearly unconscious on top of the dislodged pilot house of the Myron, telling the captain of the Franz he had been adrift for 20 hours.
He told rescuers that he stayed with the ship after his crew took to the lifeboats. 8 of those sailors were found encased in ice near Salt Point that next spring. Coins lined the fence at Mission Hill Cemetery as tributes to the sailors lost on the Myron. Miztec survived the gale, rescued by the steamer Argus after the barge's rudder tore away. The cargo of lumber from Munising was lost to Lake Superior. 2 years later, the graveyard of the Great Lakes took another swipe at the Miztec while the Zilla had her in tow. The steamer nearly sank in the killer waves trying to pull the Peshtigo and Miztec behind Whitefish Point. Peshtigo broke loose from the Miztec and put up sail to run for the beach. Their anchor held as they were caught in a spring blizzard for 24 hours. Zilla found them inside Whitefish Bay with Captain Walter Neal returning to where he was rescued to recapture the Peshtigo. The Miztec was lost forever, with its entire crew of 7.
News stories linked the captain, Nude Peterson, with the cook, Florence Peterson, who was found soon after the wreck. The captain's wife was actually Louise, and she wondered for months if her husband had survived, but found out the truth when his body was found by hunters on Parisian Island that next fall. Captain Neal said Miztec was a jinx vessel that nearly killed him in 1920. She's been a Jonah to me, and I guess I have been to her. God bless her, he told reporters.
The Zilla couldn't escape the jinx, and in 1926 the ship found a stiff breeze and rolling seas as they left the St. Mary's River en route for Duluth. The old wooden ship and a heavy limestone cargo were blamed for a massive split in the bottom as Captain Peter Ward sailed past Whitefish Point. The engineers couldn't pump fast enough to keep Lake Superior out. The steamer Schiller picked up all 14 of the crew. Today, the Zilla rests in 250 feet of water.
The most recent disaster in the graveyard of the Great Lakes is no surprise. Gordon Lightfoot sang of Superior never giving up its dead after he was moved by the loss of 29 men aboard the steamer Edmund Fitzgerald, lost 17 miles off Whitefish Point in 1975.
The 729-foot freighter was the largest to ever founder in the Great Lakes, and the disappearance of every single crewman aboard evoked the graveyard of the Great Lakes haunting mythos.
Modern helicopters and Coast Guard cutters were of no help with the sudden disappearance of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and the world was reminded of the fury of our inland seas, further testimony of what might just be the most dangerous place on the Great Lakes. I'm Rick Mixter.